Kremlin rhetoric has grown noticeably sharper as the conflict intensifies, with language and statements that some analysts interpret as a calibrated effort to prepare domestic and international audiences for the possibility of nuclear options being placed on the table. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov framed Moscow as acting within a logic of national defense while explicitly refusing to categorically dismiss nuclear responses, a formulation critics say deliberately raises ambiguity to deter adversaries through uncertainty. Russian officials have issued stark warnings aimed at European capitals, suggesting that continued military and political support for Kyiv could provoke severe consequences, language designed to pressure decision-makers by linking policy choices to potential escalatory outcomes. The Kremlin linked its nuclear doctrine, buffer zone push and demands on Kyiv to developments ahead of the NATO summit, using strategic messaging to frame territorial and security claims as prerequisites for any negotiated de-escalation while signaling red lines to Western capitals. Spokesman Dmitry Peskov said nuclear weapons would only be used if Russia's existence was at stake, a formulation intended to reassure some audiences that Moscow sees nukes as a last resort contingency while simultaneously preserving broad ambiguity about what constitutes an existential threat. Peskov claimed Russia was achieving its goals in Ukraine without resorting to nuke escalation, arguing that conventional operations and political pressure had so far met strategic objectives and that nuclear use remained unnecessary and counterproductive to those aims.
This event is attracting great interest, including from us. We will, of course, be following all the news and information coming out of Ankara. In the run-up to the summit, we heard many statements concerning our country. Unfortunately, these were not statements about constructive engagement and dialogue, but rather statements of a confrontational nature. We will see what documents emerge from all that, what statements are made, what papers are signed, and what is said during the bilateral meetings on the sidelines. You know that we are maintaining contact with the Americans through working channels, and we hope that their efforts aimed at directing the situation to a peaceful course will become successful. At least, as the Russian president has repeatedly said, we will remain open to it. Here I would like to remind you that we would prefer to settle this conflict through political and diplomatic means. And only since the Kyiv regime is not ready to engage in peace settlement, we are continuing our special military operation until complete achievement of our goals. As of now, we keep liberating Russian regions, including the Donetsk People's Republic. You know that capture of Kostiantynivka has been a very important step in tactical and strategic regards. Besides this, our armed forces continue to create a security zone or a buffer zone. This work will continue.
Peskov insisted Russia was too responsible to start World War III and described nuclear weapons as a last resort trump card, language meant to reassure global audiences while keeping deterrent ambiguity intact. He said Russia always responds to strikes in any conflict it is involved in, framing retaliatory actions as a consistent, predictable element of Moscow's military posture. He urged Europe to stop seeing Russia as a threat, stop ignoring its concerns and resume dialogue, arguing that renewed diplomatic engagement would diffuse tensions and address security grievances he says have been dismissed. Peskov repeated claims that the special military operation in Ukraine was successful and insisted it had been forced by Western policies, presenting the intervention as both justified and effective in meeting Moscow's stated objectives. The Kremlin said Kyiv and Western policies allegedly forced Russia to create a buffer zone along the border, contending that such measures were defensive necessities to protect against perceived encirclement. Peskov argued the operation was unavoidable because Europe and the US refused to listen to Moscow, portraying diplomatic failure as the proximate cause of military escalation. The Kremlin said Zelensky should pull Ukrainian troops back and legally recognize Russian territory, demanding concrete concessions it frames as prerequisites for any meaningful de-escalation or dialogue. Peskov also claimed the operation had turned into a real war because of Western involvement, asserting that external support for Kyiv transformed limited action into a broader, protracted conflict. These remarks came as Russia launched a third major attack on Kyiv in a week, a sequence that underscored the heightened tempo of the campaign and the urgent stakes observers say are shaping both rhetoric and battlefield decisions. Russia launched another ballistic missile attack on Kyiv, marking the third strike on the Ukrainian capital within a week. Powerful explosions echoed across Kyiv on July 8 as air raid sirens sounded and Russian missiles targeted the city. Fires broke out in Kyiv's Desnyansky and Sviatoshinsky districts after missile impacts, according to the city's mayor. Officials said warehouses and several non-residential buildings suffered damage in the latest round of Russian strikes. Ukraine's Air Force warned of incoming ballistic missiles, sending residents rushing into shelters across the capital. The latest attack comes just days after one of Russia's deadliest barrages on Kyiv left at least 26 people dead. A day before the assault on Kyiv, Russia also struck the southern port city of Odessa, injuring at least 10 people. Ukraine responded by targeting Russia's Shadow Fleet, striking fuel tankers operating in the Sea of Azov. Kyiv said the targeted tankers were supplying fuel to Russian forces stationed in occupied Crimea, according to reports. The Russia-Ukraine war continues to escalate through long-range missile and drone attacks from both sides. Meanwhile, Ukraine continues to face growing shortages of interceptor missiles needed to defend against Russian ballistic attacks. A devastating Russian attack hit the quiet Kyiv suburb of Vyshnev overnight on July 5 to 6, when a series of powerful blasts tore through residential areas, damaged critical infrastructure, and turned a normally peaceful neighborhood into a scene of wreckage and mourning as emergency teams scrambled to respond. On the morning of July 6, the government ordered evacuation of 600 residents over threat of detonations, instructing authorities to move people to safer locations because unexploded ordnance, unstable structures, or secondary strikes presented acute risks that made immediate relocation necessary for civilian safety. Details of the attack and eyewitness accounts were reported by the Kyiv Independent on July 6, with the outlet compiling survivors' testimonies, timelines of the explosions, and on-the-ground reports that together painted a grim picture of the strike's human and material toll. Residents of Vyshnev, located on Kyiv's western edge, described scenes of terror, people fleeing as buildings burned, children and the elderly being pulled from debris, and neighborhoods left in stunned silence punctuated by sirens and the shouts of rescuers as they searched for the wounded and missing.
My mother, 91 years old. She could not walk, she was using a walking frame. She called me, saying, "Sasha, everything is on fire. Everything was detonating. I was not allowed here. I was told to wait until it finished. I came, and this is what I saw. Most probably she inhaled the smoke and then died. Such a pity. 91, and of course she wanted to die of natural causes."
Multiple eyewitness accounts on the attack were cited by the Kyiv Independent. Diana Lyashchuk, a resident of Vyshnev, said, and I quote, "A huge mushroom cloud rose into the sky. Burning fragments kept flying behind us. They were so high, but it felt like everything was on fire. I called my mom just to tell her not to worry, that I was alive. Then another huge explosion happened. I was terrified she would hear me die over the phone." Unquote. Yevhena Denisyuk, a resident of Vyshnev, said, and I quote, "It was terrifying. Everything just kept detonating. I'm a strong woman, so I managed, but many people were crying." Unquote. Kirilo Melnik, a resident of Vyshnev, said, and I quote, "The whole house started shaking. The walls were moving back and forth. There were several explosions before dawn. The house shook like a house of cards. They're still clearing the rubble. The barbershop where I always got my haircut burned down completely." Unquote. Kate Vishniak, another resident from Vyshnev, said, and I quote, "My house is gone. Everything burned. I just feel empty." Unquote.